Hey everybody, I'm going to go ahead and give you a little video to kind of help explain the instructions for this week's assignment. It's based on the activity or the exercise that the guy in the video was doing. I'm pretty much going to have you do exactly the same thing, with the exception of I'm just going to have you use one angle of view with your camera. We're going to talk about focal lengths next week, and so I want to just kind of leave that until then. And so what I'm asking you to do is, let's see, let me just kind of go through these from the top to bottom and make sure I point out everything that's important here. Okay, let's see. Yeah, so what I mean by the focal length then is you'll have the numbers on on your lens, and I'm assuming that most of you are working with a zoom telephoto type lens. If you're working with a fixed focal length lens, meaning it does not zoom in and out, that is okay. Um, but if you most of the time, if you bought one of these cameras, they probably came bundled with one or two, you know, zoom lenses that gave you a range of options for, you know, how wide or narrow your angle of vision is. And so without going into it too much, because that's next week's subject, do the best you can to get around 50, 55, 60 millimeters on your focal length. Okay, the reason being that this is the focal length that most closely matches your peripheral vision. You know, so like if you were to take your arms and put them in front of you, and then open them up until you couldn't see them anymore, and then just bring them in until you could barely see them out of, you know, the corner of your eye, that is approximately the same angle that you have with a 50 to 60 millimeter lens. And so that's why I want to use this one. In the video, he does two different, he uses one focal length and then he uses another. We're going to do that next week. So let's just stick with one and keep it easy. And so just like he had in the video, post-it notes and a pen, and if you've got somebody who can help you with this, it'll make it easier, because then you can kind of stay at your camera and that person can kind of go do the running for you and change out the post-it notes for you. So you know, the only thing that is really important in this one, I mean, I want these to be like okay composed, and I really don't want to be as sloppy as his are actually, but you know, that my primary concern is that you find something where you have a row of identical objects evenly spaced. And, you know, this could be palm trees, it could be fence posts, light poles, just whatever. You know, it might be something you have in your house. Okay, so it shouldn't be too hard to do. Let's see. Yeah, for the first part of this assignment, you don't need to shoot in RAW. I'm going to give you some instructions, you know, to just do the first few pictures like he did in the video, and then I'm going to have you do a few on your own, kind of taking what you learned and applying it, okay? But for the first set of pictures that you take, don't bother with using RAW, okay? That's just a waste of space, you know, for an exercise. It's just a waste of storage space. So go ahead and just take your camera for this one, set it on JPEG, and go ahead and set it to the lowest image quality, the smallest image size, so that you have less problem, you know, uploading it into the little table that I gave you, okay? If you don't have a lens that goes to exactly 55 millimeters, don't worry about it. Just get as close to it as you can. You know, if you have a lens that's like, say, 70 to 300 or something, you know, that's more of a telephoto type lens, put it on 70. Okay, if you have like a super wide angle lens, you know, that say is, you know, 18 to, you know, 40 or whatever. Usually they're 18 to 55. So I'm thinking most of you are probably going to have something where you can get it on about 55. If you bought a camera recently, they come bundled usually with a lens, and that's probably the most common lens that they come with. It's something that kind of gives you an option for a wider angle, and usually that 50 range is kind of at the narrowest end, but just do the best you can. Okay, if you have a fixed focal length lens, which means it doesn't zoom in and out, then just just use it. Just use whatever you've got. But if you've got choices, I want you to go with as close to 55 as you can. Okay. Looking at the guy's setup here, I want you to position yourself just like he did. Get one of the objects in your row close to you, so you're looking kind of straight on at it, and one of these will kind of be your focal point, and then the rest of them will kind of lead your eye off back towards the horizon, or the horizon may or may not be visible. But we'll talk about that next week too, because we're going to start talking about perspective soon. Just this week, I'm only worried about depth of field though. Okay, so make sure you're using a tripod for this, not just because you're trying to avoid camera shake, but because I want to have the same exact composition on all of the pictures, so that the only thing that's different, they'll be the same composition, same exposure. The only thing that will vary will be your depth of field, okay? And I want you to apply the rule of thirds. These do not have to be beautiful, but I don't see any reason why it should be sloppy either. I think that we should always kind of practice trying to make things look the best we can. And one way you can do that, of course, is, using that rule of thirds. And so I just wanted to, pull this up. I mean, it's not like you always have to use rule of thirds, because you can see this is a really interesting image here, and it's very, very symmetrical. But for general and for now, let's use rule of thirds. Well, I'll give you some specific assignments where we play with other types of balance. But let me just see if I can point out a couple things. Like say this picture, for example, it's in pretty deep focus. I mean, even the edge of the mountain here, which is way, way off in the distance, is pretty sharp. Whereas maybe this one's a little softer in the background. They focused more on the person and less on the background. So yeah, this is a great example of kind of a shallower depth of field right here. But get it situated so that the object that's closest to you takes up approximately 1/3. And that the background, if you can see the horizon going along that, either the top or the bottom third line, is a great idea. If you can't see the horizon, there may be something else that's kind of got a horizontal, look to it in the background. Use it. If not, don't worry about it. If you'll still have the rule of thirds, even if your background is empty like this one. Okay, so just always do that. And we'll talk about composition more later on. But it's basically like that 2-to-1 ratio. So if your subject takes up 1/3, the rest of it takes up 2/3, and you can play the same trick with your horizon line. So I think it's pretty clear what the sky plane and the ground plane are. So I'm not going to even explain that. As far as light goes, I think that you'd be best off, I think this would be easiest for you if you go ahead and work outside. You don't have to, and of course you're going to be using your tripod anyway, so shutter speed isn't really a real concern. But I don't think that there's any reason to get yourself, to complicate things by getting yourself in a really low light situation. Not for an exercise like this. Let's work on something like that when that's kind of our objective. I want you to always, keep your ISO as low as you can. Okay. But if your ISO is so low that it's making you have these extremely long shutter speeds, like like most or all of your shutter speeds are, greater than a 60th of a second, go ahead and bump your ISO up, or go ahead and look for another situation, where you have more light. So, we're going to be shooting in aperture priority this time, which means you decide the aperture and the camera figures out how fast the shutter is going to go off. Okay. When we use aperture priority, the reason we're using it is because we want to have control over depth of field. Later in the semester, we'll do shutter priority, and that's a different objective. With that, you're dealing with something that's moving, and you decide how much motion blur you want. With aperture, you're deciding how much depth of field, focus and blur you want. Okay, so I'm going to let you guys be responsible for choosing the appropriate white balance, choosing the appropriate ISO, choosing the appropriate lighting situation. I think it's a good idea to go outside. If you can go outside on a cloudy day, fantastic, because you can do that at any time of day and your light will be nice and diffused. Otherwise, try to get sometime kind of in the morning or in the late afternoon, not midday. We never ever want to go out there during midday, unless we just want to really create a complicated situation for ourselves, and we don't want to get complicated here. We want to keep this as easy as possible. So just like the guy did in the video, start out with your biggest aperture, your smallest f-stop. Some of you may have like a 1 point something or a 2 point something. Fantastic, use that. It just depends on the lens. Some lenses, the biggest aperture they have is like 3 to 4 range, and you're still going to be able to get a very shallow depth of field with that. It won't be as extreme as it would be, with what we would call a faster lens, but it will still definitely work for the assignment. And so, what we mean, of course, by a fast lens, if you have a lens that's, in the f1 to f2 range, well, obviously, since the aperture is so large, the shutter can go off a lot faster, right? And so that's why we call it a fast lens. It would be ideal for catching something in motion, but it's also ideal for shallow depth of field. So whatever you can start with at the bottom, start with it and then work your way all the way down to f22. If your camera has half stops, which I'm pretty sure most of them will, just like the guy says in the video, just kind of skip over those. That's not going to be a significant enough jump for just an exercise. So, let's just say this, whatever you do between your lowest aperture, your biggest aperture, lowest f-stop, and your highest f-stop or your smallest aperture, let's say no fewer than 6 exposures. I'm pretty sure everybody's lens is capable of doing that. So, no fewer than 6 different f-stops. If you are, fortunate enough to have a fast lens, you might have 2 or 3 more, exposures than some of the other people. And but I don't, if you go higher than f22, I don't really need to worry about that. I think this gets the point across. We want to do this so we understand it, and then we want to move on and do the creative stuff. So, let's see before I move on. Okay. So before you go on to the next part of this activity, I want you to go ahead and get back into the editing room. Take these things out of your camera, pull them up in Lightroom, and look at them. Okay. And really be observant of what you see with the background changing. So you should see a very sharp, focused thing in the foreground on all of them. But your first one should have a super, super blurry background. And your last one, everything should be really sharp. Okay. And so I just want you to look at those and think about, when you might want to apply that. Under what circumstances might you want to have a shallow depth of field? Under what circumstances might you want to have a, really deep depth of field? And then I'm going to kind of turn you guys loose a little bit. This will be like your first chance to get creative. I'm going to have you do 3 exposures on your own. My only stipulation being 1 is your shallowest depth of field, your biggest aperture. 1 is your smallest aperture. And then the third one, do whatever you want. Okay, so I'm going to give you some tips here. When you do the one with the wide aperture, this is really good for flowers and portraits. Let me pull back up my little rule of thirds example here. Great example of a shallow depth of field for a portrait. In fact, we almost always want to do that for portraits because we don't want the background interfering. And so, you can have a really busy background, and that's great because it just kind of forms a, kind of an ambiguous screen. And what it does is it helps your subject really stand out. Okay, so there's just there's times when you might want it or not want it. This one is another thing. I don't really want you guys to try this right now. Let's save that for later. But you can always have foreground out of focus on your middle ground, and then let your background be out of focus as well. You can see this one's extremely shallow. Let's not do that right now. Let's just keep it simple and do, our typical rule of thirds. I always feel like a picture of a pet is a portrait in and of its own right. And so that which leads me to another thought before I turn you guys loose on this. Get down on their level. If you're taking a picture of a pet or a person or a child, you don't want to be just standing up looking down at them. That's never going to turn out good. You might have to get a little uncomfortable. You might have to get down on your knees or down on your stomach or something. But the reason that this picture is working is because the person's camera is, the center of the camera is lining up kind of in the center of the dog. In other words, the person's not way up here looking down on the dog. That just kind of looks like, a dog. It doesn't look like a portrait. Okay. So, so you can see most of the portraits on this page have extremely shallow depth of field. And so let's do that. Either portrait, flowers, a pet, an object of your choice, but something that you can get really close to you, and make sure that you have something really busy in the background. This would be one time that I would say don't just put your subject in front of a plain background, because I want you to use the shallow depth of field to make the background work for you. So put them in front of some curtains with a pattern on it. Or better yet, put them in a situation where there's a lot of activity going on around and behind them. Trees or, people doing things or just whatever. So that's what I want you to do for the first one. And then for the second one, I want you to get super sharp focused, and I'm going to ask you to do a landscape for that one. And my recommendation is you just can't go wrong with a valley sunset or sunrise if you're a morning person. We have absolutely beautiful skies. You can do whatever you want for this as long as it's a landscape. But let's really pay attention to rule of thirds here. 2/3 of the image are going to go to either the sky plane or the ground plane, and then 1/3 of the image is going to go to the other plane. Okay, so if it's a valley sunset, I would say make the ground plane the 1/3 and make the sky the 2/3, because the sky is going to be your subject. However, if you're taking a picture of something like, appear on the ground. This is your subject. Your subject's on the ground. So let's give your subject the 2/3 and let the sky plane take up, the lesser amount of space. And so these are the kind of decisions I want you guys to start looking for, and trying to make these decisions on your own. This is the difference between a snapshot and a photograph, okay? When you're thinking about every single thing you see in the lens. And with that said, you're responsible for every single thing in the lens. I think I'd mentioned a couple weeks ago, if there's everything that's in that frame, the viewer is going to assume it's intentional. So you don't want to just be so focused on your subject that you don't notice this distraction over here on the side. That somebody's foot got in the frame, or there's a table leg kind of sticking out from nowhere, or whatever. You have the power to move yourself, and sometimes all it takes is a step to the left or a step to the right, and it's changed. So keep that in mind when you're doing, especially when you're doing your landscape where everything's going to be in focus. Let's see, what else did I want to tell you about this? Lighting is really important. For landscape, I definitely would, go early morning or late afternoon, early evening kind of time, and take advantage of that fantastic light. That light that we call the golden moment. And if you're kind of out there shooting right before sunset and the sun is like really, really low in the horizon, you've got about this 10 or 15 minute period where everything just looks fabulous. Be set up for that. If that's what you want to do, I would take my tripod and just go ahead and get it set up, get the composition I like, and then just start shooting and just keep shooting. Get everything set up the way you want it, and leave it on aperture priority, okay, and let it figure out the shutter speed on its own, and just keep shooting. And keep shooting until the sun goes down, and you should have a really nice progression of images going from lighter to darker, and then choose the one that you think looks the best, and that's what we should always do. Don't ever just go and take one picture, okay, I'm done. No, you need to take, you have nothing to lose at all, because this is digital. Don't be satisfied with one or two exposures and then just, okay, we're done, let's go. Take 20 or 30 exposures so that you know that you're going to get at least 2 or 3 good ones. A lot of time, almost always, the first couple exposures aren't going to be your best, because you're going to figure things out as you're going to notice things, and you've got the luxury of working with that screen on your camera, which is great. Because back in the olden days, traditional photographers didn't have that. They had to think about, had to kind of envision what that was going to do. So, these are the first photographs I'm assigning you that I'm actually going to, kind of hold you somewhat accountable for decisions that you make, and trying to make things look good. So yeah, I think that pretty much explains the first two. The third one, I'm just going to leave that up to you. Do whatever you want. Experiment, different subjects, different depths of field, just as long as the depth of field is part of your consideration when you're shooting the photograph. Okay, we don't want it to be an afterthought. In other words, we want to be thinking about this every time we go out and shoot. We want to have this as part of our decision-making process. That's the difference between a snapshot and a photograph. Okay, don't be lazy. I know that shooting with the tripod can be kind of cumbersome. I find it cumbersome as well, but you're always going to do best if you have one, especially for something that you're putting a lot of thought into like this. Have your tripod with you, just in case. Don't use your flash. Okay, don't just use your flash indoors, because you didn't want to change your shutter speed to something, too slow for camera shake, right? Um, if you're going to shoot in a lower light situation, use your tripod, you know. Don't go and use your 3200 ISO. That's kind of extreme. Not when you can get away with 400 and a tripod. Okay, so I'm hoping that this is kind of starting to make sense. Lighting of your subject from the side is always better. Okay, we don't really want the sun or the whatever light source coming straight at the flat facing surface of whatever you're shooting. It's always better to have it coming from the side. Um, have it coming from behind your shoulder, unless you're taking a picture of the sunset and then the sunset is your subject. And of course the light is much dimmer then, but I'm going to let you guys kind of find your way around that on your own. And then, go ahead and take them into Lightroom and make a couple of decisions. Find your best three, your best one for each of the three assigned images. And if you need to tweak them a little bit as far as like exposure or white balance, go ahead and do so. If you don't think they need anything, don't do anything. But it's really kind of pretty rare that we don't do at least a little editing on our photographs. So what I'm hoping then is that the first part of this activity is going to get you really comfortable with making decisions about your aperture. And the second part of this assignment is going to give you a chance to use those decisions creatively, to use them artistically. Okay, so have fun with this one. I don't think it's as complicated as the last one. I know the last one was probably kind of difficult, but we got it behind us now, so we can move on. We're that many steps closer to doing art, and you actually are doing art in this one, because your last three photographs are going to be artistic. Okay, so just like before, I don't think I need to explain this anymore. Just put your picture in there and whatever it is I'm asking for. The last three images, I do want you to provide a statement. I want a 150-word or more statement that, talk about the process. Tell me about the decisions that you made. Tell me why this is a good picture. Tell me why you chose the subject that you chose. Why is it working with the decision that you made on the aperture? How is depth of field impacting this image, and why did you choose the aperture that you chose? Why is it perfectly right for this image? Okay, so just whatever seems relevant, go ahead and provide that for me, please, in complete sentences. And then as always on these activities, reply or comment to two other people. Okay, go ahead and I guess I need to take this part out there. If you know the answer to a question, no, I'll leave that. If maybe somebody does want to answer somebody's question, so I'm going to leave that in there. But when you're commenting on somebody else's picture this time, have the very same objectives in mind when you're looking at their images that you had in mind when you were making your own images. Okay, so let's talk about them in those terms. Okay, so I think you guys will have fun with this one, and I think when you get finished with it, you're going to come out on the other end feeling like you know a lot more than you knew at the beginning, and you're going to have so much more control over what you do. So I'm looking forward to seeing them. Have fun.